The big news of today is, of course, that we had an election yesterday. Well, actually we had two. We had by-elections for members of Parliament in Stoke Central and Copeland, both of which were previously held by Labour MPs until they both resigned to take jobs in the private sector, which was generally regarded as not a good indication of confidence and party unity if your MPs are not just switching sides but actually leaving Parliament altogether to go and work for a nuclear power plant. That maybe suggests you've got some issues inside your party. So they did that. So we had to have elections yesterday to replace those two MPs who resigned. Well, technically they didn't resign, because technically you can't resign as an MP. No one employs you. You've been elected. You can't actually resign once you've taken up the seat. You can't resign before you've taken up the seat. There is a party in Northern Ireland who run in Westminster elections. They're... Sorry, a fly just flew into my nose. Sinn Féin don't take up their Westminster seats because they are philosophically and politically opposed to being governed from Westminster. So they stand in the Westminster elections, but they don't take up their seats. So their seats are vacant, because just because they haven't gone to Westminster to take the seat doesn't mean that they're not the MP. You can't just hold another election to get rid of them. That's not how it works. You can't resign as an MP. What you can do is get yourself appointed as steward of the Chiltern Hundreds, or another ceremonial position, which nowadays does nothing. It's a purely ceremonial position. But once upon a time, when this convention started, it represented a material conflict of interest with your role in Parliament, so you could not both be steward of the Chiltern Hundreds and an MP. So while you were steward of the Chiltern Hundreds, you were disqualified from being an MP. So once you had been appointed as steward of the Chiltern Hundreds, they had to have a by-election to replace you with somebody who was not disqualified from being an MP. This is still the method. It does nothing else. You have no rights or responsibilities as steward of the Chiltern Hundreds, but you're not allowed to be an MP at the same time, for reasons. So they appointed these, I think they were both men, they appointed these MPs to purely ceremonial positions, which are legally held to conflict with being an MP, and held by-elections. Now, Stoke Central was probably the more reported on beforehand, because the current head of UKIP, Paul Nuttall, was standing in Stoke Central. I say current because they changed leaders at UKIP the way I change shirts. There's a new one every week. I change my shirt more often than that. That was a poor analogy. Anyway, he was standing in Stoke Central. In the end he came in second, just barely above the Conservatives, but the seat was held by Labour by a margin of something like 2,700 votes. So it was a fairly close race, but not particularly a political upset in the end. Labour did okay, Labour held the seat. Copeland, however, the Conservatives took Copeland last night. It now has a Conservative MP by, again, a margin of a couple of thousand votes. But that's really unusual. Seats going from the opposition to the governing party in a by-election is really unusual, because a by-election tends to favour the opposition. Unlike a general, where the country's kind of all over mood about whether they like the government, whether the government is doing a good job, the way society in general is going, how much money they've got in their pocket right now. All of that is relevant in a general election. In a by-election, it's just the one seat, maybe in this case two, being contested. So it tends to just turn into a direct referendum on the government, because the government is definitely not going to change based on the results of this by-election, right? The MP is going to change, but the government is not. So these by-elections tend to favour the opposition, because you only have to be a little bit discontented with the government to vote against them in a by-election, whereas you might have to be a lot discontented to vote against them in a general. Especially if your natural tendency, your home is with. So if you are a natural Conservative voter and you're a habitual Conservative voter, it takes a lot for you to vote against them in a general election. But in this by-election, well, the government's not going to change. So you might vote Labour, or you might stay home. The government taking a seat from the opposition in a by-election, that's big political news.